We are taking a huge stack of historical records and archaeological reports to basically peel back the pavement of Sydney, Australia.
We really want to show you how this landscape transformed from an ancient indigenous cultural hub into a highly dysfunctional penal colony and finally into the megacity you see today.
So to really get how that transformation happened, we have to start way before anyone ever uttered the name Sydney.
Right, because the prevailing colonial myth, the one that was in all the old textbooks, is that the British fleet showed up to this pristine, totally empty wilderness.
The whole terra nullius concept.
Exactly, empty land. But the anthropological sources we're looking at today just completely dismantle that. We're talking about a civilization that thrived in the Sydney Basin for, well, somewhere between 30,000 to 65,000 years.
I mean, I have to just pause on that timeline. 65,000 years.
It's almost impossible to process.
It really is. That means people were managing the land and building societies tens of thousands of years before the first pyramids were even a thought in Egypt.
Oh, absolutely. And the sources refer to the coastal peoples of the Sydney area collectively as the Eora Nation. And the word Eora itself is actually super fascinating.
Yeah, I saw that. It literally translates to here, or from this place, right?
So when the British arrived in 1788 and, started asking the local Aboriginal people who they were, they just said Eora.
So it wasn't like a political title?
No, not at all in the European sense. They were explaining their intrinsic geographic connection to that exact spot.
But wait, I need to stop you there, because a lot of those early colonial logs paint this picture of just one giant homogeneous group covering the entire coast.
Yeah, they do.
And if we're talking about a landscape that massive, they couldn't have all just operated under one single culture, right? How did their society actually work?
They absolutely didn't operate as a monolith. The term Eora Nation is actually a much later categorization.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Before 1788, the Sydney Basin was this incredibly complex patchwork of roughly 29 distinct, highly localized clan groups.
Okay, wow. 29.
Yep. And right in the heart of central Sydney, like the modern CBD, Circular Quay, where all the tourists go, that was the specific territory of the Gadigal people.
And what blew my mind in the archives was how they maintained their distinct identities, like without physical borders or fences.
It's essentially a masterclass in cultural engineering.
Because I was reading about their initiation ceremonies, and it totally upends how we think about border control. They didn't have passports.
Right. They used their own bodies.
Yeah. They used their bodies as visual markers.
It's a brilliant way to conceptualize it. The records show that coastal men, especially within clans like the Gadigal, would have their right incisor tooth removed.
Right, during a specific coming-of-age ceremony.
Exactly. So if you're a coastal man and you travel further inland toward the Blue Mountains, you might encounter the Dorarug people.
And the second you speak or smile, they instantly know you're from the coast.
Precisely. That missing incisor immediately communicated your geographic identity. And the inland groups had totally different initiation rites, different dialects, different ways of managing resources.
It was this highly sophisticated, interconnected network. And they mapped their sovereignty right onto the landscape, too.
Oh, the rock engravings.
The sheer volume of them is just staggering. We're talking thousands of sites.
Yeah, the one at Ball's Head is probably one of the most famous.
Right, the one recorded in the 1890s with the massive outline of a man inside a whale. But these weren't just, decorative art, were they?
Not at all. They served a really vital civic function. They were made using this pecking technique, right? Hammering holes into the soft Hawkesbury sandstone with a hard stone.
And then grinding it into a groove.
Exactly. And these engravings were basically maps. They were title deeds. They recorded animal migration patterns and spiritual narratives.
They were the physical infrastructure of a culture that was just deeply tied to the harbor. I mean, they were building bark canoes to fish for snapper and farm rock oysters.
But then, of course, we hit 1788. The arrival of the British First Fleet.
And reading through the data, it wasn't just a culture clash. It was a biological apocalypse.
The absolute devastation of disease. The British brought over pathogens to a population that had been completely isolated for millennia.
They had literally zero biological immunity.
Right. So in 1789, just a year after the British dropped anchor, a massive smallpox epidemic swept through the basin.
And the mortality rates in the archives are just chilling. We aren't talking about a bad flu season here.
No, it's estimated that roughly half of the entire Aboriginal population in the wider Sydney region died in just a matter of months.
Half the population. But for the Gadigal people, the numbers are almost impossible to fathom.
Yeah, the colonial journals of David Collins, he was a British officer at the time, They provide the grim accounting.
Right. What were the exact numbers again?
The Gadigal population went from around 60 individuals in 1788 down to just 3 people by 1791.
60 down to 3. And the logs actually named 2 of those survivors, right? Colby and Nanbury.
Yes. And this brings up a really critical misconception about how cities record their history. The colonial narrative treats that demographic collapse as an endpoint.
Like, the locals were wiped out, so the British just built on a blank slate?
Exactly. But that completely fundamentally misunderstands human resilience.
Yeah, I want to push back hard on that blank slate myth. Think about it. If a modern city got hit by something that wiped out 95% of people, the survivors wouldn't just vanish into the woods.
Like they'd find each other.
Exactly. They'd scavenge, they'd regroup, and they'd adapt to the new reality.
And that is exactly what the records prove happened. The Gadigal and the surrounding clans didn't vanish. When your clan structure collapses, you adapt.
So they essentially formed a coalition of survivors.
They did. By the 1820s, the records show over 200 Aboriginal people living around Elizabeth Bay, Potts Point, and Woolloomooloo.
Which are super affluent inner city suburbs today.
Right. And they maintained their cultural connections while adapting their economies to this dense new urban center. It's just an incredible display of resilience.
It really is, especially when you contrast it with the people who actually caused the collapse.
Oh, the British colonizers.
Because the sheer incompetence of the newly arrived British is honestly hard to comprehend. The First Fleet was a logistical nightmare from day one.
Well, you have to look at the geopolitical pressure driving it. In 1788, the British government had a massive domestic crisis.
Because of the American War of Independence. Right. They couldn't ship convicts to America anymore.
Exactly. So their domestic prisons are literally overflowing. They're housing prisoners in these decommissioned warships, the prison hulks on the River Thames.
Which were completely disease-ridden.
Oh, dangerously overcrowded. So the government basically looks at a map, points to the furthest charted corner of the globe from James Cook's voyage 18 years prior, and says, let's put the prison there.
It's such a wild gamble. Captain Arthur Phillip gets put in charge of 11 ships sailing 16,000 miles with over 1,400 people.
And 736 of them were convicts.
So they initially aim for Botany Bay because of Cook's glowing reports. But when they actually get there, it's nothing like the brochure.
Cook was a brilliant navigator, but he definitely wasn't a city planner. Philip gets there and immediately realizes Botany Bay is useless for a settlement.
Because it was too shallow, right? The ships couldn't get close to shore to unload.
Exactly. And even more importantly, the soil was incredibly sandy and porous. Fresh water just drained right away.
And you can't build a city without agriculture and water.
Right. Philip knew if they stayed, they'd starve. So within days, he orders the fleet to sail a few miles north into Port Jackson, which is modern-day Sydney Harbour.
Which was a massive real estate upgrade, deep anchorages, natural coves, and that freshwater tank stream.
But, a good harbor doesn't magically teach convicts how to farm.
No, it doesn't. And those early sources depict a colony literally teetering on the edge of total starvation.
The logistics were just deeply flawed. They brought rations to last until their crops grew. But these convicts were petty thieves from London slums, not farmers.
Plus, the climate and the seasons were totally inverted from what they knew.
Right. The seeds wouldn't sprout, and their tools literally broke in the hard clay soil of Sydney Cove.
So they're just sitting there, starving on the edge of the world, waiting for the Second Fleet. And when it finally shows up in 1790, it's not a rescue mission.
No, it's an absolute catastrophe. The government had contracted the voyage out to a private slave trading firm.
And they were paid per head boarded in England, not per head landed alive in Australia.
A catastrophic misalignment of incentives. The contractors just starved and abused the convicts to save money.
Over a quarter of them died on the way over.
And then they dumped hundreds of desperate, emaciated people onto a colony that already didn't have enough food.
It is such a grim origin story. But somehow, against all odds, they eventually learned to farm inland around Parramatta.
The colony does stabilize. And that's when the socio-political reality turns into something resembling a mafia cartel.
Right, we have to talk about the money, or the lack of it. Because the British didn't send a reliable supply of physical coins.
Which is a huge problem. You can't build a society from scratch without liquidity.
You have to pay laborers and buy land, so what do?
They find a proxy currency. They tried promissory notes, but those were forged. Wheat receipts could rot.
So they needed something everyone wanted that wouldn't go bad and was highly divisible.
And in a colony full of traumatized convicts and bored soldiers, that commodity was rum.
Rum literally became the fiat currency of New South Wales.
Yes, you could buy a plot of land or pay a carpenter with gallons of rum.
Which is funny to think about until you realize whoever controls the liquor controls the government.
Enter the military guard, the New South Wales Corps.
Rum Corps.
Exactly. The officers realized they had a monopoly on violence and authority. So when a merchant ship arrived with spirits, they'd pool their money, buy the whole cargo, and artificially inflate the price.
They built a literal cartel. They controlled the economic choke points.
They paid their soldiers in rum, bought up huge tracts of land, and got staggeringly wealthy.
And John MacArthur is the most notorious figure here. He starts as a lieutenant, but quickly becomes this massive landowner and essentially one of Australia's first oligarchs.
Which inevitably puts them on a collision course with London. In 1806, the British government sends a new governor to break the cartel.
Captain William Bligh. When I read that in the sources, I had to double take, as in the mutiny on the Bounty guy.
The very same. They picked him specifically because of his rigid discipline. He was sent to dismantle the rum trade and strip the elites of their power.
But sending an abrasive disciplinarian to break up an entrenched mob operation just seems so naive. He shows up and immediately starts revoking leases and banning rum as payment.
And MacArthur, backed by Major George Johnston, the commanding officer, basically says, we're not surrendering our wealth.
The tension just builds until January 26, 1808, the Rum Rebellion.
And this wasn't just a riot, it was a highly organized tactical military coup. Major Johnston mobilizes about 200 heavily armed soldiers.
They marched right to Government House with bayonets fixed.
Yep. They surrounded the building, marched inside, arrested Governor Bligh, and deposed him.
The only successful military coup in Australian history, all to protect their right to use liquor as currency.
Right. The sources note they didn't call it the Rum Rebellion back then. That was a later historian's term. But it was absolutely a fight over capital and control.
And they actually ran the colony themselves for 2 full years after that. MacArthur was basically the chief power broker.
Total breakdown of imperial authority. But in 1810, the British say playtime is over and recall the entire Corps in disgrace.
And they send in Governor Lachlan Macquarie.
Macquarie is probably the most pivotal figure in transitioning Sydney from a prison camp to an actual city.
Because he brought his own military unit, the 73rd Regiment, to actually enforce his rules.
Right. And he looked at Sydney and saw the potential for public works, roads, urban planning. But even he couldn't escape the rum economy.
This brings us back to the hospital, the public-private partnership from hell.
Yes. The medical infrastructure was just rotting tents in the rocks. He desperately needed a permanent hospital.
But London was broke from the Napoleonic Wars and told him to figure it out himself.
So Macquarie enters into a contract with 3 local businessmen, including the principal surgeon, Darcy Wentworth.
They agreed to build a state-of-the-art hospital completely free of charge.
Right, but nobody builds infrastructure for free.
So what did they get? A 3-year monopoly to import 45,000 gallons of rum, which later got bumped to 60,000.
It's an astonishing ethical paradox. You fund a public health facility by flooding the market with the exact substance causing the public health crisis.
It's wild. And of course, the contractors cut every conceivable corner to maximize their rum profits.
Oh, the construction was a disaster. Francis Greenway, a convict who was a brilliant architect, inspected it.
His report was scathing, right?
Oh, completely. Weak foundations, substandard mortar, dry rot in the timber columns. He essentially said it was going to collapse.
But the poetic irony is that parts of it survived. The northern wing is now the facade of the New South Wales Parliament House.
The modern seat of political power is literally built on a corrupt rum monopoly.
It's just so perfect. But moving into the 1850s, it wasn't urban planning that changed the city next. It was geology. Gold.
To understand the gold shock, you have to look at the economy before 1851. It was dominated by wool.
And wool has a huge barrier to entry. You need thousands of acres and the capital to buy sheep.
Exactly. So wealth was concentrated in a small group of elite landowners, the squattocracy.
The working class were locked into these low-wage jobs with zero leverage. But then they find alluvial gold.
And alluvial is the key word. It's in riverbeds and shallow dirt.
Right, no deep shafts or heavy machinery needed. The barrier to entry was basically zero, a shovel and a tin pan.
Which meant that tens of thousands of chronically underpaid workers suddenly realized they could walk away and dig up a year's wages in an afternoon.
It totally gutted the traditional labor force. Shepherds abandoned flocks, police left for the gold fields, sailors jumped ship.
It completely reversed the supply and demand for labor. Landowners had to drastically increase wages to keep anyone around.
It decentralized the wealth and basically birthed the Australian labor movement. High wages, an 8-hour workday.
Sydney boomed into this chaotic commercial hub. But unchecked rapid urbanization has a dark side.
Always. The boom gives way to the depressions of the 1890s.
Housing couldn't keep up. Landlords subdivided these old terrace houses in places like Glebe, Paddington, and the Rocks.
The archives describe these slums as a public health time bomb. Narrow alleys, open sewers, unregulated factories dumping waste.
And massive wooden wharves handling international cargo. It was the perfect vector for disaster.
Which arrived in 1900, the bubonic plague.
The literal Black Death brought by infected fleas on rats from cargo ships.
And the government's response was just completely draconian.
They basically seized the waterfront, put up barricades, tore down hundreds of dilapidated buildings, and hired rat-catching brigades.
It's that recurring theme, a catastrophe forcing the city to reinvent itself. They completely modernized the port facilities.
A port that would face a totally different existential threat just a few decades later in World War II.
May 31st, 1942. This fundamentally altered Sydney's psychological landscape. Up until then, the war felt far away.
But the Imperial Japanese Navy was operating right outside the harbor. 5 fleet submarines had quietly positioned themselves there.
And they launched a reconnaissance float plane the night before, which people actually saw, but they just assumed it was American.
The complacency was deep. But on Sunday evening, they launched their secret weapons. 3 Kohioteki-class midget submarines.
The engineering of these things is terrifying. 20 meters long, battery-powered, carrying 2 massive torpedoes.
And inside, it was basically a steel tube barely big enough for 2 men.
The claustrophobia must have been unbearable.
Poor oxygen, terrible navigation. The first sub, M27, tries to infiltrate around 8:00 p.m.
But the harbor had this massive underwater steel mesh anti-submarine net.
Right. And M27 drives straight into it. Its propellers get hopelessly entangled.
Imagine being Lieutenant Schumann or Petty Officer Omori, trapped in a metal tube in the pitch black underwater, deep in enemy territory.
And their thrashing alerted the watch. 2 patrol boats, the Euroma and Lolita, come out to drop depth charges.
So they realize they're caught, and they know they can't let their tech fall into Allied hands.
So they adhere to their military code. At 10:37 p.m., they detonate their internal demolition charge, destroying the sub and committing suicide.
The explosion triggers the general alarm. The other 2 subs get in, and it's just 9 hours of total chaos.
Searchlights, blind firing, torpedoes in the water. One misses a cruiser and blows up under a ferry, killing 21 sailors.
Tactically, it was a failure for the Japanese, but psychologically for Sydney, it was massive. The war was literally in their living rooms.
Real estate prices plummeted. People were terrified of a full-scale bombardment.
But amid all that paranoia, I found this detail in the archives that just perfectly highlights the local pragmatism.
The fish stories, eh?
Yes. So the Navy had been dropping depth charges all night trying to crush the subs.
Which created massive underwater concussions.
And those shockwaves stunned or killed thousands of fish. So the next morning, the harbor is a literal war zone. Sunken ships, military everywhere.
And what do the locals do?
They wade right into Taylor's Bay with buckets to collect free, freshly stunned fish for dinner.
It's just a remarkable juxtaposition.
It's so surreal, like pausing an explosive war movie to go grab some free takeout. But that pragmatism really pushed Sydney through the 20th century.
It did. The city was desperate to transition from a colonial outpost into a globally recognized metropolis.
Which brings us to the monuments, the bridge and the Opera House. Let's start with the Sydney Harbour Bridge in 1932.
People had wanted to span the harbor for a century. Even Francis Greenway suggested it in 1815.
But the tech just wasn't there until the 1920s, driven by this visionary civil engineer, John Bradfield.
Bradfield wasn't just building a bridge. He designed a whole integrated subterranean railway network to feed into it.
He over-engineered everything. 4 lanes of road, 2 train lines, 2 tram lines, and a pedestrian walkway.
In an era when most people were still using horses and trams, he was designing for a massive motorized future.
And the construction by Dorman Long was a marvel, using that cantilever method, building 2 arches out over the water until they met in 1930.
When it opened in 1932, 1 million people showed up.
Which is mind-blowing because the whole population of Sydney was barely over 1 million.
The whole city basically came out to walk across it. It was a huge triumph during the Great Depression.
It really was. But then a few decades later, they build something totally irrational that plunges the city into chaos. chaos, the Opera House.
The drama here is basically Shakespearean. It starts in the 50s with Eugene Goosens pushing for a world-class venue.
And he insists on Benelong Point, which is an incredible full-circle moment because it was named after a famous Eora man and was a Gadigal gathering place.
Right, so in 1957, they hold a design competition, and a relatively unknown Danish architect named Jørgen Utzon wins.
His design was completely unorthodox, those massive sweeping white sails floating over a podium.
It was beautiful, but the physics were a massive problem.
Yeah. Wait, nobody actually knew how to build the sails, right?
Nobody. The freeform curves he sketched literally defied 1950s engineering capabilities.
But the politics took over. The Premier forced construction to start in 1958 before they'd even solved the engineering.
It was a disaster. They poured the concrete foundations without knowing the weight of the roof.
And when they figured it out, they realized the foundations were too weak, so they had to dynamite their own work and start over.
Exactly. Utzon and the engineers spent years trying to figure out how to build the curves. Custom wooden molds for every unique curve would have cost an infinite amount.
So how did Utzon solve it, the spherical solution?
Right. Imagine building a roof out of irregularly shaped, unique potato chips.
Okay.
Every mold has to be custom. But if you carve all those different chips out of the surface of one single massive sphere, they all share the exact same underlying curvature.
So you only need one mold.
Exactly. You can mass produce the precast concrete ribs.
It's so elegant. But politically, it was too late. The budget had totally hemorrhaged.
The initial estimate was $7 million. It finished at over $102 million, 1,000% over budget.
And the new government basically froze Utzon out, right?
Yes. The relationship became so toxic that in 1966, he was forced to resign. He left Australia and never saw the finished building in person.
And the crowning insult is the 1973 opening. Queen Elizabeth II is there, global fanfare, and Utzon's name isn't mentioned once.
He was completely erased from his own masterpiece.
Which raises such a fascinating question. How does a catastrophic political failure become a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a national symbol?
Because visionary architecture operates on a generational scale, not an election cycle. Over time, the scandals evaporate, inflation forgives the budget, and only the beauty remains.
And those bold leaps really set the template for modern Sydney. It's a polycentric megacity now, constantly rewriting its geography.
Still trying to solve the same logistical problems Macquarie and Bradfield wrestled with, connecting a diverse population across a tough landscape.
You see it in the Olympic Park remediation of that toxic industrial wasteland at Homebush Bay.
You see it in the Sydney Metro expansion, retrofitting 21st century robotics onto 19th century rail lines.
And the new Western Sydney Airport opening in 2026. These are just the latest iterations of a 200-year effort to stitch it all together.
It really proves urban renewal is just a constant cycle of erasing the obsolete and engineering the new.
Which brings us right back to our original mission, peeling back the pavement. And what we found isn't a neat timeline.
We found a 65,000-year-old culture that mapped the sandstone and survived a biological apocalypse.
A penal colony that almost starved, run by a rum cartel.
A hospital funded by a monopoly on the substance ruining public health.
A wool oligarchy dismantled by guys with shovels looking for gold.
Slums cleared by medieval plagues. A harbor invaded by midget submarines.
And an iconic opera house born from an impossible sketch and bitter politics. It's a city born of contradiction.
And that archaeological find from 1989 really sums it up. At Lily Vale on Cumberland Street, right near the skyscrapers.
Under the colonial brickwork, they found an intact Aboriginal campfire carbon dated to around the year 1500.
With snapper bones and oyster shells, just streets away from Macquarie's Rum Hospital.
And right across the water from Utzon's Opera House and the seabed where the submarine sank.
It forces you to look at the city differently.
Absolutely. When you walk through a modern city, you aren't just walking on a sidewalk. You are walking over 500-year-old campfires and buried rebellions.
The intensely messy reality of human survival.
Exactly. So what monumental structures are we building right now that might eventually hide our own messy realities from the people of tomorrow?
It's a slightly unsettling, but totally fascinating question to ponder.
It really is. Keep digging, keep questioning the ground beneath your feet, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.